I'm building an Australian Swagman inspired survival game in JavaScript with Phaser and Angular, and in the last video we mostly looked at this fire mechanic. The focus for the next batch of work was on taking that mechanic and polishing it to the point of being a very basic game with a very basic game loop. Each step of the way in this process I want to have small but also completed and polished features so that I can make sure I'm actually building something fun and coherent. But first there was just a small bit of housekeeping. The first issue I tackled was something you would think would be simple to fix. The character moves comically fast, and you might think this would be an easy thing to change, just drop the speed down a little, right? Well, unfortunately math and pixel art combine here to create an annoying scenario. Let's say we have a movement speed of 1, as in if the player is moving to the right, we will add 1 to the player's x coordinate. If they are moving down, we will add 1 to their y coordinate. But what if they move diagonally? If we add 1 to both the x and y coordinate, we can use a little Pythagoras to calculate the total displacement, which is about 1.4, so the user moves about 40% faster on the diagonal. No worries though, we can instead just rearrange this equation to calculate a and b for our desired displacement of 1, which works out to be around 0.7. This would be fine ordinarily, but since I'm working with pixel art here, if we try to move the sprite using a non-integer value like 0.7 instead of 1, we run into sub-pixel rendering issues. I can either render a pixel here or here. There is no rendering a pixel 70% of the way between two pixels. The result is that the movement of the player looks glitchy like this if we don't use a whole number for the x and y displacement. There are proper ways I could go about addressing this. One option is to scale the assets up so that it maintains the look of pixel art but isn't actually rendering at a pixel scale. But for now, I've just gone with having the player move faster on the diagonal. It's not even that noticeable anyway, it's not going to be detrimental to gameplay, and I have much higher value things to focus on for now. I may revisit this in the future, especially if sub-pixel rendering issues become a problem for other things, but for now I'm happy with it. So back to the fire. We already have this basic fire mechanic going where one item on fire will spread to other combustible items nearby. And in order to start a fire, you need to go through the process of lighting some tinder first, use that to light your kindling, which can ignite your small fuel, and then your small fuel can ignite your large fuel. Attempting to light larger fuels right away just won't work. Initially, I just spawned a few items next to each other to test, but now I want to add a bit more to the gameplay here by spreading the fuel around the map and have the player have to forage for it. Now, I can place a bunch of fuel randomly throughout the map, which I did, but there is a bit of a problem. As much as possible, I want to replicate the feeling of actually being out in the bush, and you certainly don't have this superhuman bird's-eye view of your surroundings where you can easily find everything you need. So I came up with the idea of having smaller entities only show up when you are within a certain distance of them. This is a win-win because not only does this actually add to the gameplay, it is also much better performance-wise. I don't need to render everything on the map, I only need to render what is immediately close to the player, and I can also remove those items when the player moves far enough away from them. I was able to get this feature almost for free because I already set up this proximity grid system for the fire spreading mechanic. And it's the same basic idea here. Instead of finding nearby items to transfer heat, I am just finding nearby items to render or remove. Even if I add a silly amount of items to the screen, we are still able to maintain a decent FPS. And just to address the obvious here, I haven't dealt with the draw ordering of sprites yet, so the player just currently moves behind everything. The effect of items popping in and out was a bit jarring initially, but I also added this fade in and out animation for when the items come in and out of view, which made it look a lot nicer. And another aspect I like here is that although you cannot see items from a distance, if I light a fire, I will still be able to see the actual fire from a distance, which makes sense from a realism point of view. Now, of course, the temptation here is to let the intrusive thoughts win and see what happens if we light one of these objects whilst there is a ridiculous amount of combustible items on the screen. The word chaos comes to mind, but surprisingly the performance is somewhat okay here. It's about the same as the small bonfire from the last video. There's definitely some noticeable lag, but we are able to maintain 30 to 40 FPS even though the entire map is filling with fire, which results in a lot of particle effects, but also a lot of code running simulations on each combustible item and its neighbors. This does actually provide some interesting opportunities. To incorporate this into normal gameplay, I would need to optimize it some more. But if large fires like this are actually feasible, it provides incentive and more realism for carefully managing fire and making sure it doesn't get out of control. So the last part of this batch of features is the warmth mechanic. I mentioned that I wanted to make this playable as soon as possible to make sure the mechanics I'm building are actually fun, even if the gameplay is extremely limited. So I added this warmth mechanic to give some purpose to the fire. This allows me to create a very basic game loop. Your warmth decreases over time, you need to gather fuel to start a fire and keep warm, and then this allows you to go out and find more fuel. I needed to keep track of the warmth for the player, and there are going to be a ton of things in the future I'll need to keep track of for the player, as well as triggering a bunch of different animations at different times. So I took the time to refactor a lot of the player behavior into a state machine, just like I did for the combustible items. This gives me much greater control over the animations and state, and I was able to easily add this warmth context. It is easy enough to have the player's warmth decrease over time. The tricky part was having the fires apply heat to the player. But I already have a system where an item that is combusting can find its neighbors and apply heat to them. So I basically just added my player into that same system. Basically, the player became a fuel item that can have heat applied to it, but it won't apply heat to other things. I'm not sure exactly how I want to indicate warmth to the player in the long term, but as a visual indicator for now, I just added a shader to the camera that will cause it to darken as the user's warmth value decreases. This is extremely exaggerated for now since it is the only survival mechanic in the game, but you have a little over 1 minute to get a fire going before the screen will become completely dark. Later on, there will be much less emphasis placed on warmth for survival, but it will still be there. As I was testing this and collecting some materials to create a fire, I noticed the screen getting visibly darker, and it actually did feel a little stressful. I felt a sense of urgency to actually get the fire going, and even in this rudimentary form where it is quite easy to get a fire going, the logistics involved in collecting the right materials and keeping track of where I put them added to the feeling of urgency. One unintended side effect here, because I forgot to clamp the value being used for the shader that is darkening the camera, is that when the player gets too warm, the screen will actually start becoming brighter and brighter. I might end up keeping this in some form, as I suppose there probably should be some consequence for the player becoming too hot. I think for the next batch of features, I'm going to work on breathing a bit more life into the environment. Add some trees, collisions, deal with the draw ordering, perhaps have the user collect tinder from bark on trees instead of it just being on the ground. And if I've got the time, I also have an idea I want to try out for adding the ocean and tides. So we'll see how far I get on that, but I do hope you'll join me here for the next video by hitting subscribe before you go, and I hope you have a great day.